And since I'm standing here, why don't I moderate the questions? You'll have to help me, Heidi. Do we take them from the audience? And we don't have a roving.
Make sure you repeat it.
I'll repeat if you either talk loud and I'll repeat it. Nick.
Okay. Since there are two people here at least, and a number of others who are very familiar with UC Berkeley, I will address it to you and Bill. Given what you know, Charleston's great. I really don't care much about Charleston, but I do care about our country. Given contents damage, and you've done a lot of work, and what we've seen now in Chile and New Zealand, the ceilings coming down in relatively modern structures. What is your opinion about what is it going to look like in the buildings that we have retrofitted and maybe that we haven't, in terms of shutdown time, labs, and whatever? So it's maybe ceilings for Bill and contents damage for you.
So that question, which was from Nick Sitar, was what's really going to happen at UC Berkeley for those of us who've spent a lot of time on the retrofit program here, asking Bill about the ceilings and me about the contents. Gee, Bill, do you want to go first?
I think the new building.
Bill, can you come up? Because otherwise they can't hear you on the web.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, there is a lot of new buildings, as you know. I think, although we have difficulty getting the non-structural done according to the code, I think UC Berkeley is making a big attempt at that. I think if buildings are built in accordance to the code, you will have some damage, but I don't think all the ceilings are going to come down. Many of the buildings you have retrofit, structurally, you have used that opportunity to refit. And so new things that are put in are going to also be all right. I think buildings that have old lay-in ceilings, are going to come down or are going to be damaged the way we've seen in other countries. Systems are not that much different. But I think overall, Berkeley is in better shape than an average cross-section of buildings by far.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think we're in very good shape and better shape, certainly, than we were a decade ago. I'm still very worried about the contents in labs. One of the things that really impressed me in New Zealand was the culture of safety that existed in the labs that I don't see here, frankly, and I don't see in most U.S. universities. I think people work fast and very efficiently, and there's just not this top-down set of rules about putting those chemicals away every day and getting them locked up in places where they won't fall and that sort of thing. And I know that a lot of our building managers and a lot of our lab managers have made Herculean efforts to try to change this culture and to improve it. And in some areas it has improved, but I think we have a long way to go in both changing that culture so that we can fix the things that are easy to fix administratively, and also, brace the things that we know need to be braced. So I think we have work to do. More questions? Yes?
You mentioned insurance mandated. What's the deductible on those policies?
$250.
Yeah.
Almost zero.
Almost. The question was, what was the deductible on the insurance policies? And it is almost zero. I think it's about $250, somebody said. It's virtually nothing.
If I could ask a
What? Sure.
You mentioned information forthcoming on non-structural damage due to the need to document for insurance claims. Who's going to follow up on that?
Well, I'm going to follow up with the University of Canterbury. I don't know whether we will get what we will be able to get from private businesses. I mean, this is a typical problem because businesses don't like to talk about those things. So it's hard to get that information in the private sector. I think the university will be forthcoming once they know what they have. I mean, they're still in the process of documenting what they've lost. An interesting example was that they had, on the first day after the earthquake, they did an inventory of IT stuff, and they just sort of started in one building, and they basically lost about 20% 20%, 15 to 20%. And so they just blanket ordered, computers and servers and that sort of thing because they knew they were going to need them. And then they were doing assessments kind of building by building. But if you know from your first investigation that you've lost 15 to 20% of your IT, that's not insignificant in terms of a number that's going to add up over a whole university. So, I think those numbers are going to be pretty big by the time they get done. Bill?
I think the other thing we have going for us is that New Zealand earthquake engineers are very active and very good. And for those businesses that will release data, I think in the ensuing months, I think, there will be papers and compilations of that damage. But, we had trouble getting the information, and we know here that engineers for certain clients can't really release that information. But I think anything that will be released will be documented by the New Zealanders.
Heidi, do we have any questions from the folks watching online?
Yeah, I do actually. So let me just read this one. So this is from Paul Somerville, and it's for Scott Ashford, so I don't know if you want to come up. The USGS and Harvard show a magnitude 7.0 strike slip mechanism with consistent strike slip faulting seen in the field. Do you know the basis for reverse faulting mechanism?
That's the hard part.
Oh, great. Yeah, here's a geotech trying to answer a question by a seismologist. The New Zealanders, their seismological organization there, everyone initially thought that it was primarily strike slip, and after looking at additional data that they had, they believed it was primarily and that's coming from the New Zealand seismological group, and they believe that it's the reverse faulting.
But it was complex.
It was
reverse at depth, which came up to the surface of strike slip.
Reverse at depth and came up to the surface of strike slip with some additions here from John Heidecker.
That was according to Andrew King of the GNS.
So Paul, I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, this is another one from actually a student in London. Yeah, we have another one from someone from Costa Rica too. So we actually had really good. We've got a broad audience today. But the question from London is related to architectural aspects. And I know that Fred mentioned a few, but to kind of paraphrase the question, it's really did you in past earthquakes they found that certain architectural styles result in additional either enhanced earthquake damage or kind of or they actually improve the little earthquake damage. So were there anything kind of unique to this New Zealand earthquake where architecture influenced the seismic damage? More than already stated.
Well, this one isn't an easy one to characterize in that way, primarily because the ground shaking was low and the duration was short. So, the older unreinforced masonry buildings are of a particular architecture style or a vintage, which, had more damage. But otherwise, no. I think there were not, there were modern buildings of different styles and varieties. Concrete buildings, some of them had some damage, some of them did not. Really, we couldn't, there wasn't much in the way of soft story, was there? There were not soft stories particularly in existence.
There were no three-story apartments either.
Yeah, there were no three-story apartment buildings because they don't have any. There are no apartment buildings. Yeah, everybody lives in sort of one-story, single-family homes. So, in a sense, they didn't have all of the sort of architectural styles that we sometimes attribute to damage. Do you want to take another question from the audience here, and then we'll, yes?
This follows on from the architecture. In the 60s, basically there was a big movement to change from unreinforced masonry to reinforced masonry. I'm curious, and there was a real architectural style. Miles Warren and Marnie developed the style of civic buildings. Through the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of that building style. I'm curious whether there was any damage, because it's the same form, that they're really a load-bearing masonry construction, that they are more than concrete masonry. There's a lot in the same regions that
Fred's going to answer that, take that question.
I can try.
He's going to try.
Thanks. Yeah, I think he's asking about the introduction of reinforced concrete or reinforced masonry in lieu of unreinforced masonry in the 1960s. Is that how I would paraphrase it? Yeah, there was a...
Unreinforced masonry was banned and was
Right.
mitigated in 69, banned by 76.
That's correct. In a lot of ways, it parallels our practices here in California, at least, in that we banned unreinforced masonry buildings starting in the 1930s, and largely reinforced masonry replaced that. We actually saw quite a few reinforced concrete masonry unit buildings, and they performed remarkably well with very little damage. Some of them with not so ideal configurations as well. So I'm not sure this was truly a test for many modern buildings, in large part because of the relatively low levels of ground motions at short periods of vibration. So I'm not sure you can read a lot into the good performance of reinforced concrete masonry unit buildings. Maybe that's what I should have said.
May I? Sure. Is the lack of short period simply due to the liquefaction, that you basically had base isolation as a result of widespread liquefaction?
Scott,
Scott, you want to
You rephrase the question.
Are you going to answer that one, John?
Well,
Great, go for it.
all right, all right.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. Well, was the lack of short period motion or high frequency motion because of liquefaction? When we were out there, we saw that the Christchurch is built on about 300 meters of gravel, and the site period, if you go through, we have shear wave downhole velocity data of about 300 meters per second, which should give a site period of about 2 seconds, which showed up clearly in the response spectra at many of the sites. And it showed a de-amplification at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 hertz in the response spectra. So if you are a 4 hertz building, you saw not much more than PGA, somewhat more, but not much more.
That was true for like the entire city on gravels.
I'll take another. Yeah.
So this is another question from a colleague in Costa Rica. They're asking a question to any one of the speakers about bridges. With so much ground deformation and liquefaction in the epicentral area, kind of what's your general experience on bridges and how do they perform?
Okay. Yeah, Michel Bruno was looking at the bridges from the gear team. There was also from the ERI team. Ed Kavazanchin and I also looked at bridges for the gear team. The bridges performed pretty well. You know, what we saw is a lot of, there was quite a bit of minor damage. There was many places where they had some abutment approach fills that had settled. They came in and repaired those rather quickly. There was some cracking, you know, at the abutments, but for the most part, bridges performed well in this earthquake, with the exception of some old pedestrian bridges that were significantly damaged, but the bridges did well.
We visited with NZTA. That's the organization that maintains all the state highway bridges. They have about 900 bridges in the epicentral area. They went out and looked at all the bridges within about 3 days. In the strong shaken area, about 43 bridges. For the last 15 or 20 years, they were doing much like Caltrans did. They were putting horizontal restrainers between spans for the bridges that had been built post-1950. And although some were a little bit stretched, they popped off some of the restrainers. None of the spans fell off. For the pre-1950 built bridges, which had very little seismic design, the good news was they were all like short, single-span bridges, so they didn't have any or beams to fall off. So that was good news. NZTA suffered about $6 million of damage for their bridges. And they are currently continuing their seismic upgrade program to put on steel cans around their piers. That's not yet been done. They recognize this earthquake was on the 0.25 to 0.35 G for most of their bridges, were not that much of a challenge. In terms of tunnels, there was no damage due to strong shaking of more than a few ceiling small minor cracks in several major tunnels. So that's good news, and they had no tunnel portal failures that we know of.
Let me just ask if there are any final questions from the audience? Yes. Well, let me ask the gentleman in the back who hasn't asked one yet.
I understand that the ground motion of all the periods was equal to, or in some cases higher than their design ground motions. It indicates you should have seen some damage in the taller buildings. Did you see anything at all?
Well, very little.
Bill? Yeah. I mean, you can say that up here. I think the question was there damage in the taller buildings?
Yeah, there is a response spectrum that I guess will be published in a newsletter, right? That shows that bulge for small periods it was below, and for larger periods it was above, exactly at about 2 seconds.
In Christchurch.
In Christchurch, right? And in the fields out near the fall, it was much higher. But so you would think that some of those buildings, similar to the Westpac building, would have been in that range, but they're maybe a little bit more stiff than that. They're stiffer. That was a core building, even though it looked like a moment frame building. So, but the answer to your question is there was very little structural damage in modern buildings. That's the bottom line. Could have been duration. It could be that they designed their buildings, a little over the code for whatever reason. There was few obvious configuration problems that we saw. The buildings are pretty boxy, you might say. So there were no issues like that we could see. So, and frankly, there were just not that many. There was not that many, not a big inventory.
And the R values are smaller than ours.
Well, that too, yes.
In the back, in the red shirt?
I have a question about relative cost of relative performance levels, I guess. I was in Haiti, where you guys haven't seen anything damaged here in New Zealand. And clearly Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, one of the couple. And New Zealand is much better off, and there's some dollars that have been spent that have gotten to a life safety level, which is non-collapse in New Zealand, which is more or less our theoretical target. So everything's succeeded, or most everything succeeded in New Zealand. How much would it cost to increment that up to non-structural damage, or how much would it cost up into non-contents damage? And what would that take to change codes to move that way?
Well, that's a hard question. John, why don't you answer that?
I'll just in terms of suspended ceilings, we asked around there in New Zealand. There were a bunch of ceilings that came down. They don't know if anybody was injured. But again, the earthquake was not at the daytime. Suspended ceilings there cost about $3 a square foot to put up. Seismically designed suspended ceilings that are really seismically designed, not just laterals and compression stress, but properly designed, may cost $50 a square foot. So people aren't going to spend that unless it really is essential. At TransPower, they had seismically designed raised floors. These are not your little pop-in panels raised floors. They're like their own structural systems, complete with braces and everything else. If you want to do it right, it's going to cost money. And it's not just 30 cents more, 10% more than the initial cost, at least for these raised floors and suspended ceilings.
But, I just want to add a comment to that. I think, the question is a little bit, the question of, well, what was the cost increment to make everything perform better than non-structural and the contents? I don't know that that's the right question. I don't know that we want our entire building stock to be operational. I think it's irrational. It doesn't make any sense. I think we have to learn to accept some damage and decide which kind of damage we can accept and where. We really would not like to see those kinds of ceilings come down in the emergency rooms, for example, of hospitals, or maybe in schools. Those are places where those things are much more important. But I think we're not, I don't think it makes sense, even in the developed world, to be asking, this is my personal opinion, I can't speak for the whole group, but I don't think we can ask, that of our building codes. I don't think that's what the purpose of them is.
Well, that isn't back, of course, the point of my question.
Yeah.
Did New Zealand perform as good as one would target, more or less? Or how much further would we want to target?
I think if you look at the outward statistics, the performance was acceptable. However, if you're actually in Christchurch, I think their perception is entirely different. They had 125 red-tagged URM buildings. Almost all of those posed really very significant threats to life safety. They could see that. And now there's probably some debate as to whether they've overreacted now and established a mandatory strengthening program. But believe me, they understood that had that earthquake had occurred at another time of day, we would be having a very different discussion today than the premise of your question. So, and I think that's the basis upon which they're moving forward now, and they're really trying to address those life safety risks that in fact did manifest itself in this earthquake.
Well, we're probably way over our time. So shall I cut off the questions? Or shall I take one last question? One last question from the gentleman in the white shirt.
You said there was no fault expected where the earthquake occurred. Did they look for a fault there and just not see it? Or did they just not look there? Or what was the...
Scott?
Yeah, the question was that they were not aware that the fault was at this location. I think there's two things. One is that New Zealand has a very complex seismology, and so it's not unexpected that these faults would appear in areas where they hadn't been located before. The other thing is that there's quite a bit of, my understanding is that there's quite a bit of more recent sediment over laying at where the fault is located, and so that there was no recent evidence of faulting where, in recent times.
With that, I would like to thank all of the audience for attending, thank the folks online for participating, and thank our speakers for their great contributions. Thank you, Pierre, for hosting us. Thanks very much.